greatest football player I'd ever seen was Carlton Chester Gilchrist.
He probably is the greatest football player that we've never heard of.
He was the biggest running back I've ever seen.
I think he played at 259 pounds with power and speed and deceptiveness.
If you got in his way, I mean, it was him or you, and he usually won that battle.
99.9% of the time, he knocked me on my ass. It wasn't fun.
I've also heard stories of him putting cleat marks on the backs of his offensive linemen because they couldn't get out of his way fast enough.
If you guys don't block, I'm gonna run up your butt.
I was the lead blocker. I had to block the linebacker, so I blocked the linebacker. He went down, I went down on top of him, and all of a sudden I had this sharp pain in my back, and it was Cookie. He stepped on my back and jumped over into the end zone and scored a touchdown.
He was serious about winning. He wanted to win.
This guy could do everything with a football.
He not only played fullback, he played linebacker.
He could tackle as hard as anyone.
Cookie was a great blocker.
He could catch the ball with the best of them.
He kicked off.
Was a field goal kicker.
If he'd figured out a way how to pass the ball to himself, he'd have been quarterback too.
When he had the football in his hands, I would dare say there wasn't anybody more feared on the football field than this guy.
He was one of the best fullbacks that ever played the game.
Mistrust usually comes from mistreatment. You're talking about in the early 60s in America, where if a black man is even driving in a car with a white woman, they would be stopped, and he was.
There were two policemen, and they said, "What are you doing with that nigger?" I thought they were all crazy. I thought they were insane. The hatred terrified me.
He was actually thrown into jail for even associating with a white woman.
Cookie was calling from a cell. Don't be afraid. He continually was telling me not to be afraid.
Suddenly, you can see the clouds forming, that this guy is now getting, fairly or unfairly, a reputation.
Cookie was besieged by devils of maybe some of his own making.
He was very strong-minded. As a matter of fact, he was bull-headed.
He challenged management at every turn. He had run-ins with coaches.
He was angry with Paul Brown. He was angry with Ralph Wilson. Was he angry with himself?
People in the league painted him as a malcontent or a bad guy, which he really wasn't. He was just a guy who was beaten down a lot. The late Jack Kemp always viewed Cookie as a misunderstood person and said was one of the great people he's ever known in his life. The thing about Carlton Chester Gilchrist is that he was a guy who was ahead of his time, but at the wrong time. He's certainly ahead of his time in terms of his views of social justice. There's an all-star game in New Orleans, and Cookie and some other players were very poorly treated.
I went to get a cab.
Cab driver came over and said, "You need a black cab." And Cookie said, "I don't care what color a cab is, I want a cab." And of course, they meant that he had to go in a cab that was reserved for blacks.
We've had enough. We're not going to play a down in this town for the American Football League.
It's over. We're gone.
Cookie said, there comes a time you just absolutely have to take a stance, and we think this is the time.
I was 100% behind the guys.
It was the beginning of black athletes becoming activists. He had genuine social courage.
But I think with that, there's a price to be paid, and I know there's I think it's a Japanese expression that the nail that sticks out gets hammered.
Cookie Gilchrist was always the nail that stood out, and always the nail that got hammered down. For much of his career, Cookie was a guy that just missed.
He started something that they're just beginning to do right now in the National Football League.
Cookie wrote this manual.
He talked about education, he talked about health, he talked about concussions.
How to take care of former athletes.
Everything they're doing now, Cookie talked about it. If that program could have been put in place, these things would have been addressed 20 years ago.
You knew he had your back.
Dad was like that. He was about the facts, being truthful,
and step up and make a difference in somebody's life.
He was very principled, and if he said something, he meant it.
He was the first human being that showed any concern.
He was one of the real friends that I've had.
This cookie didn't crumble. This cookie refused to crumble.
He feared nothing, nor no man.
His story is haunting in some ways.